March in Central Ohio can't decide what it wants to be, and the morning Sergeant First Class Damon Hicks drove through Marysville had the specific in-between quality of a season negotiating with itself. Cold enough for a coat. Warm enough to doubt the coat. The sky the particular gray of something that might clear or might not. He had been on his way to the VA outreach office in Columbus when Sable went rigid at the passenger window with both paws on the glass, and stayed that way, which she did not do. They were passing the entrance drive of the Marysville Veterans Care Center, and at the curb near the facility's side entrance, beside a green dumpster that had its lid propped open with a cardboard box, was a black trash bag that had split at one corner, and through the split, catching the gray March light in a way that no piece of garbage should catch light, was the edge of something gold and red on a ribbon. Damon pulled over before he had decided to. He got out. He reached into the split in the bag. What he pulled out would tell him, in the language of a military decoration that he recognized before he had fully processed what he was holding, the complete shape of a wrong that had been committed that morning by someone who had not understood what they were throwing away. And what he did with the next 4 days would ensure that the man who had earned it would receive it back before he was moved somewhere it could never reach him. If this kind of story is why you're here, subscribe now so you're there when the next one is told. Damon had joined the Marines at 20, the son of a Columbus mechanic who had taught him that the correct approach to any broken thing was patience and full attention. Take it apart carefully, understand what went wrong, put it back together correctly. He had applied this to everything the Corps asked of him for 14 years. Including 2 tours in Helmand Province, and one in a theater his discharge papers described in terms that didn't quite match the geography he remembered. And he had come home to Central Ohio in 2021 with a medical retirement and a left shoulder rebuilt around hardware that set off metal detectors and that told him things about the weather with a reliability his phone's forecast could not match. He worked outreach for the Franklin County Veterans Services Commission now, driving the rural counties north of Columbus once a week to check on isolated veterans and ensure they knew what the system had decided they were owed. He drove Sable to every visit because Sable was better at arriving than he was. The quality of her presence in a room communicated something about intent that took most humans longer to establish. He had been doing this work for 2 years and had come to understand it not as a job, but as the application of the patience his father had taught him to a category of broken things that the system kept creating faster than it could fix. Sable was a 4-year-old Weimaraner, gray-silver, long-legged, with amber eyes that held the quality of a dog who is always slightly ahead of the situation, who has already processed what you are about to say, and is simply waiting for you to arrive at it. She was 67 pounds of sustained attention. She communicated in look and placement. Where she went in a room told you what the room contained before anyone had said a word. And her silences were more articulate than most dog sounds. She had been with Damon since a Veterans Day adoption event in Delaware County 18 months ago. And in that time, they had settled into a partnership that his former battalion commander would have described as force multiplication. Each of them made the other more effective, and the combination was greater than the sum. The medal in the bag was a Distinguished Service Cross. Damon held it in the March cold for a moment. He had seen one before, had seen it in a display case at the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, under glass, in the context of history. This one was on a ribbon that had the specific softness of fabric handled many times over many years, turned over and examined, and put back in a case or a drawer with the care of something precious. It was not in a display case. It was in a split trash bag outside a dumpster at the Marysville Veterans Care Center, and the Distinguished Service Cross was the nation's second highest military decoration, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat against an enemy of the United States. and whoever had put it in a trash bag did not know that. He went inside. The facility's front desk directed him, after a conversation that required the specific patience his father had taught him, to the director of resident services, a woman named Karen Pruitt, who was competent and pressed for time in the way of everyone in every care facility he had ever visited. He showed her the medal. She recognized the seriousness of it from his face rather than from the decoration itself, because she did not know what a Distinguished Service Cross was, which was part of the problem. She told him what she knew. A resident named Harold Voss had been at the facility for 3 years, a retired electrical engineer, 87 years old, a veteran from the Korean War era who was quiet and self-contained, and who had been, by the staff's account, a man who kept his own company without appearing to mind it. He had a son named Mitchell, who was his primary contact. Mitchell had come 2 days ago and spent 4 hours in the room and had left with several boxes, and had told the front desk that Harold was being transferred to a memory care facility in Cincinnati, closer to Mitchell's home. The transfer was scheduled for Friday. Today was Tuesday. Sable had been standing beside Damon during this conversation with the quality of attention she brought to rooms where something had already happened and the consequences hadn't arrived yet. She looked at Karen Pruitt. She looked at the door that led to the resident wing. She looked at Damon once. Then she walked to the door and stood at it and waited. Have you ever held something in your hands that told you a whole story before anyone had said a word? If you have, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. Harold Voss was in his room, in the chair by the window, reading. He was a small man who had, even at 87, the quality of contained precision, nothing wasted, nothing performed. A man whose attention when he turned it toward you was total, and whose default was to turn it toward whatever was in front of him and give it the courtesy of full engagement. He looked up when Damon came in. He looked at Sable, who had gone to the chair and sat beside it with the settled authority of a dog claiming a post, and something moved through his expression that was not quite recognition and not quite surprise, but something between them. Damon held out the medal. Harold looked at it for a long moment. His hands came up from the book he had been reading, slowly, the way hands move when they are approaching something they have not touched in a long time and are checking whether the approaching is allowed, and he took it and held it in both hands and did not speak for a long time. "Where did you find this?" he said. It was not quite a question. It was the voice of a man who has done the arithmetic and knows the answer and is asking in order to give the other person the chance to say it. "Outside," Damon said, "near the dumpster." Harold looked at the medal. Then he looked at his hands. He said, Mitchell was clearing things. Those 4 words carried the weight that 4 words can carry when they are said by a man of 87 about his only son, in a voice with no accusation in it and no performance of forgiveness, just the flat and experienced delivery of a man who has been dealing with a specific kind of grief for a specific number of years and has reached the far side of it, where the grief is simply accurate. Sable pressed closer to the chair. Harold put one hand on her back. Damon sat down. Over the next 2 hours, in the room with the chair by the window and the book face down on the side table and the March light going from gray to grayer, Harold Voss told him what the Distinguished Service Cross was for. He had served with the 2nd Infantry Division in Korea, 1952 to 1954, and in July 1953, 3 weeks before the armistice, he had performed an act of sustained courage on a ridgeline outside Kumsong that the Army's citation described in specific military language, and that Harold described, when Damon asked him to, in the matter-of-fact language of a man who had been there and understood that what had happened was simply what needed to happen, and that the right response to it was to come home and do the work of a life, and not make it a story. He had been an electrical engineer for 31 years. He had been married to a woman named Frances for 44 years. He had a son who had come and cleared his room without asking about the box on the shelf. Damon thought about a staff sergeant from his first Helmand tour, named Curtis Branch, who had been from Findlay, Ohio, 40 miles north of Marysville, and who had been the kind of man who would have pulled over for a split trash bag in the time it took to process what was in it, and who had died outside Songdon in 2011 at 28 years old, and whose Distinguished Service Cross Damon had seen in the display case at Quantico and had stood in front of for 11 minutes. He did not say this. He listened. What happened next moved faster than most things in care facility administration move, because Damon was not waiting for the system to find its pace. He called a veterans advocacy attorney in Columbus named Sandra Holt, who confirmed that a resident's personal property, including decorations, could not be legally disposed of without the resident's informed consent, and that the distinction between Mitchell clearing things and Harold being consulted about what to clear was a distinction with legal weight. He called the Franklin County Veterans Services Commission and spoke to his own director, who knew the facility's administrator and who made a call that afternoon. He called the Ohio Veterans Hall of Honor, which had a standing program for identifying and honoring veterans of extraordinary distinction, and whose coordinator, a man named Phil Geary, who had been running the program for 8 years, said the words Distinguished Service Cross, 2nd Infantry Division, Korean War, and went very quiet, and then said, "What do you need from me?" The urgency was Friday. The transfer to Cincinnati was Friday, and once Harold was in Mitchell's sphere in a memory care facility 100 miles away, the ability to intervene in the disposal of his remaining belongings would require legal processes that would outlast the Friday timeline by weeks. Wednesday morning, Damon drove back to Marysville. Mitchell Voss arrived at the facility on Thursday afternoon. He was 58. A civil engineer with the specific practical manner of a man who manages logistics, and who has applied that skill to the question of his father's care, in the way that practical people apply their skills to emotional situations, systematically, with a plan. With scheduled steps and a timeline, and the conviction that executing the plan correctly was the same as doing the right thing. He had arranged the memory care facility in Cincinnati with considerable care and expense. He had not arranged it with his father's input, because his father had a diagnosis that Mitchell had decided meant his father's input was unreliable, which was a decision made with genuine concern and without the full understanding of what his father was still capable of. He came in with a folder and the bearing of a man who had already resolved this question in his own mind, and was here to complete the resolution. Sable was at Damon's side the moment Mitchell walked through the door to the resident wing's common room where the meeting had been arranged. She didn't growl. She didn't position aggressively. She stood at Damon's left heel with the complete stillness of a Weimaraner at point, locked, everything forward, amber eyes on Mitchell with the quality of attention that is its own kind of declaration. Mitchell looked at the dog. Then he looked at the room. Damon was there. Sandra Holt was there. Phil Geary from the Ohio Veterans Hall of Honor was there, and he had brought something. A printed document, a certificate, and a photograph that he placed face down on the table because the time for it wasn't quite yet. Karen Pruitt was there. And Harold Voss sat at the table in his chair with his Distinguished Service Cross in front of him on the table, between his hands, in a room with people who knew what it was. Mitchell looked at his father. He looked at the medal on the table. Something moved through his face that was not guilt, not yet, but the first awareness of a gap between what he had understood and what the room was telling him was true. He said the things he had planned to say, The memory care facility in Cincinnati was excellent. The transfer was in his father's best interest. The room in Marysville was being held past the date he had arranged for, and he was here to ensure the transition happened as planned. He had power of attorney. He said that phrase with the specific weight of a person who has been leaning on it. The room let him finish. Then Harold said, "You threw away my medal." 5 words. Quiet, looking at his son. Not with anger. Harold Voss was not a man who had the energy left for anger about this, which was a different kind of devastating. He said it the way a man says something he has been considering whether to say for 24 hours and has decided is simply true and deserves to be stated. Mitchell looked at the Distinguished Service Cross on the table. He looked at his father's face. The color of the room changed. Sandra Holt spoke before Damon needed to. She described Harold's consent rights regarding his personal property. She described the specific legal status of military decorations. She described the distinction that mattered, which was the distinction between Mitchell's plan and Harold's participation in it. She named the Ohio Veterans Hall of Honor and what Phil Geary had come to offer. She said the transfer to Cincinnati was not illegal and was not being contested. What was being contested was the manner in which Harold's belongings, history, and remaining decisions were being managed without him. Phil Geary turned his documents over. He explained the Hall of Honor's recognition program for veterans of extraordinary distinction, and what the Distinguished Service Cross qualified Harold Voss for, and what the ceremony would look like if Harold chose to participate, and that the invitation was permanent. It would wait for Harold, regardless of where he was living. Then Damon spoke. He described what the Distinguished Service Cross was for. He read the citation, slowly, the way his father had taught him to read anything important, with the full weight of each word given its due. A ridgeline outside Kumsong in July 1953. 3 weeks before the armistice. An act of sustained courage that had saved 4 men and held a position and earned the second highest military decoration the Army awarded. He had been 22 years old. He had come home and been an electrical engineer for 31 years and had told his son none of it, which was his right. And his son had cleared the room without asking. Which meant that Mitchell Voss had been 58 years old until this afternoon and had not known what his father had done at 22. Mitchell looked at his father for a long time. Harold looked back at him with the patience of a man who has been waiting for a long time to be seen clearly and has not been sure it was going to happen. Sable walked from Damon's side to Harold's chair and lay down across his feet. The transfer to Cincinnati was delayed, not canceled. Mitchell had arranged it carefully, and Harold, when asked directly and with Sandra Holt present, agreed that closer to his son was what he wanted, if what was being moved with him included his history. What was negotiated in that room on Thursday afternoon was not the destination but the manner of the going. Harold's belongings would be inventoried with Harold present. His decorations would travel with him, properly stored, documented, and understood. The Hall of Honor ceremony would be scheduled for the following spring at a location Harold could attend. The ceremony took place in April at the Veterans Memorial in Columbus on a Saturday morning with a low sky that cleared around 10 and let the sun come through in the specific way that April's sun comes through in Ohio. Like something that has decided to try again. Harold Voss sat in the front row in his dress uniform, which still fit with only minor adjustments, and received his Distinguished Service Cross back from the hands of the Ohio Adjutant General, and there were photographs taken. And Mitchell stood beside his father for one of them, with the expression of a man who has learned something important and is still processing what it changes. Damon stood at the back of the room with Sable at his heel and watched. He thought about Curtis Branch from Findlay, Ohio, who had died at 28 and whose distinguished service cross was in a display case at Quantico. And he thought about the specific and unrepeatable nature of what happens when a 22-year-old from Central Ohio holds a position on a ridgeline in Korea and comes home and tells no one, and lives to be 87, and has his medal thrown in the trash by the only son who never knew. He thought about what it meant to retrieve something, not just the medal, but the meaning of it, the identity it represented, the proof that a man had been more than what his diminished years had allowed people to see. There are certain things you can give a person back. And there are certain things, if you fail to give them back, that no subsequent kindness can substitute for. What Damon Hicks had done was not the heroism of a ridgeline. It was the smaller and necessary heroism of stopping when a dog went rigid, and paying attention, and refusing to let a man's life be summarized by a split trash bag in a March parking lot. He had the same Tuesday morning as anyone else. Sable went rigid. He pulled over. He looked inside. This story is for every veteran whose history was handled by someone who didn't know what it was, and for every family member who has cleared a room and found something they didn't recognize and set it down without asking. Ask. There is still time. Is there a herald in your life? A veteran whose service nobody around them fully understands? Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one. Let's fill this section with names that belong in the light. Every story on this channel is about pulling over when the dog goes rigid. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.